In 1978, a 15-year-old boy walked onto a New York City subway, and within days, two men were dead. What disturbed investigators wasn't just what he'd done, it was how he talked about it afterward. No fear, no guilt, no regret. He said he'd done it, in part, just to see what it felt like. His name was Willie Bosket, and the state of New York was about to discover it had no law built for a child like him. To understand Willie, you can't start with the subway. You have to start with a question that follows this case to this day. Is a child like this born or built? Because the deeper you go, the harder that question gets to answer. Willie was born in Harlem in 1962. He never really knew his father, but his father's shadow was everywhere. Butch Bosket was, by all accounts, a brilliant man and a convicted murderer, locked away for killing two men years before Willie was old enough to understand what that meant. Willie grew up on stories of him. And here's the strange part. He didn't grow up ashamed of his father. He grew up idolizing him. That's the first thread investigators would later pull on. Not a boy running from violence, but a boy running toward it. Because to him, it looked like a family legacy. By every measure that mattered on paper, Willie was intelligent. Teachers noticed it. Psychologists noticed it. He was sharp, articulate, quick. Which makes what came next harder to explain, not easier. Because by his own count, before he was even 16, Willie claimed to have committed thousands of crimes. Robberies, assaults. A childhood spent cycling in and out of juvenile facilities that were supposed to correct him, and never did. But here's what most people miss about that period. Every time the system got its hands on him, it treated him as a child to be rehabilitated. And every time, he came out further gone than when he went in. Then came March 1978. Over the span of just over a week, Willie shot and killed two men during robberies on the New York City subway. Both men were named Perez. Neither was related to the other. And the coldness of it, the sheer absence of anything resembling remorse, is what turned a local tragedy into a national reckoning. Because when the story reached the public, one detail landed like a punch. Willie reportedly described the killings almost as an experiment. Something to feel, something to try. A 15-year-old talking about ending two lives the way another kid might talk about a dare. And that's the part I want you to sit with for a second, because it's the whole reason this case matters. This wasn't rage. It wasn't a moment that spiraled out of control. It was calm, and calm in a 15-year-old terrified people far more than anger ever could. What's striking about how Willie was caught is that, in a sense, he wasn't hiding. By 1978, he was already a familiar name to the system, a teenager with a long record. Someone police and juvenile authorities had cycled through their hands again and again. So when the subway shootings happened, investigators weren't chasing a ghost. They were looking at a boy the system already knew. But here's the detail that unsettled the people questioning him. When it came time to talk, Willie didn't break down. He didn't beg, he didn't deny, he explained. Investigators later described a young man who spoke about what he'd done with a flatness that didn't match the crimes. No performance of guilt, no attempt to soften it. To the people in that room, it wasn't the confession of a frightened kid who'd made a terrible mistake. It was something closer to a report. And that calm, that total absence of the thing we expect to see in someone who's just taken two lives, is what turned a hardened investigation into something genuinely disturbing. Because you can build a case against anger. You can understand a crime of passion. But how do you make sense of a 15-year-old who feels nothing at all? And then came the twist that no one outside the legal system saw coming. Because Willie was 15, his case didn't go where the public assumed it would. It didn't land in an adult criminal court. in front of the cameras, facing the full weight of a murder charge. It went to family court, the part of the system built for children, the part designed to be private, to be protective, to rehabilitate rather than punish. Proceedings there were confidential by design, shielded from the public precisely because they were meant for kids who could still be saved. And that's where the shock detonated. When word got out about what the system could actually do with Willie Bosket, the number landed like a slap, a maximum of around 5 years. Placement in a juvenile facility. For 2 people killed, not a life sentence, not adult prison, around 5 years. And then, in theory, a clean slate. The public couldn't reconcile it. 2 men were dead. The boy responsible had spoken about it without flinching. And the most the law could offer in return was a handful of years in a system meant to nurture him. The gap between the crime and the consequence didn't feel like mercy. It felt like a failure written directly into the law. And that feeling, that raw, collective outrage, is what would climb all the way to the governor's desk. Here's where the Willie Bosket case stops being a crime story and becomes a legal one. The outrage was immediate, and it was loud. In 1978, New York passed the Juvenile Offender Act, legislation that, for the first time, allowed children as young as 13 to be tried as adults for serious violent crimes like murder. It was signed into law, and it changed the trajectory of juvenile justice, not just in New York, but as part of a national shift toward trying young offenders as adults. People didn't even call it by its official name. They called it the Willie Bosket Law. A 15-year-old boy had, in effect, rewritten the rules for every child who came after him. But here's the question that haunts this case. Did the law fix anything? Or did it just prove Willie's point? Because Willie's story didn't end with a sentence. In many ways, it was only beginning. In the years that followed, in and out of custody, Willie became one of the most difficult and dangerous individuals the prison system had ever tried to hold. Attacks on staff, repeated violence, sentences stacked on sentences, until the total stretched far beyond anything a single crime could explain. He was eventually held in extreme isolation, cut off almost entirely from human contact. And it was from inside that isolation that Willie said the thing that still defines him. He described himself, in essence, as a monster. But not a monster who was born. A monster the system had created. That's the line researchers and writers have wrestled with ever since. The author Fox Butterfield traced the Bosket family's history of violence back generations. Through poverty, through the American South, through cycle after cycle that never broke. His argument wasn't that Willie was innocent. It was that Willie was, in a terrible way, inevitable. So we come back to where we started. Was Willie Bosket a boy who felt nothing because something was missing from the very beginning? Or was he a boy the world slowly, methodically emptied out, one failed intervention at a time? The honest answer is that we may never fully know. And that uncertainty is exactly why his case still sits at the center of one of the hardest debates in criminal justice. What do we actually do with a child who kills and feels nothing at all? If Willie Bosket showed us a coldness the system couldn't explain, the next case shows us something even more unsettling. Because the next child didn't just feel nothing, she wrote it down. In her own diary, in her own handwriting, she recorded exactly how it felt to take a life. And the words she chose still stop people cold today. Her name was Alyssa Bustamante, and her story is next.